for the election, would you have looked into that Democratic state member as well?
Absolutely.
You mentioned earlier talking about, individuals pushing back on these false claims. When you're talking about the fake electors, you mentioned a congressman from Pennsylvania who I guess would have been a witness who might have pushed back on the fake elector scheme being legal. Do you recall saying that earlier?
I do.
Who was that member?
My recollection, I think his name was Thomas Marino. He was a former U.S. attorney, and he's a Republican, former congressman, and he had agreed to be, and this is before the election, agreed to be an elector for Donald Trump. And when he was presented with this idea of the fake elector scheme, my recollection of his reaction was that this was an attempt to overthrow the government, and it was illegal.
You also mentioned a few of the states that Mr. Trump and his co-conspirators, such as Mr. Giuliani and Ms. Powell, targeted about these false claims about the election. Do you recall which states were the main targets of this group?
Yes, I believe it was 7 states. Let me count them. Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona. I'm missing one because New Mexico was memorable because he lost that by 10%. There's one more I'm forgetting.
Nevada?
Nevada, thank you.
And I just want to confirm Nevada was the last state, is that correct?
That's
correct. Okay. Did your investigation uncover why Mr. Trump and individuals like Mr. Giuliani and Ms. Powell might have selected these 7 states?
Well, the states were all states that he lost by a pretty small margin, except for, again, New Mexico was 10%. I mean, depends what you define as small, but the others were all much closer than that.
And these states had all voted in support of Mr. Biden being president, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So just to be clear, Donald Trump had lost all 7 of these states, but it appears narrowly, depending on how you define narrowly.
That's correct.
One of the bigger parts of your report, and which you've talked about here today, comes down to the knowledge, Mr. Trump's knowledge that he had lost the election. I know you've talked about it at various stages of today, but I would just like a pretty clear answer, if you don't mind, about what evidence did you collect about Mr. Trump's knowledge that he had indeed lost the election of 2020?
Okay. Well, there are 2 types of knowledge. One, that he lost the election, and another, that the things he was saying, the fraud claims, were in fact false.
Now I want to start with the first one, that
Yeah.
you said that he had lost the election.
Yeah. I think, again, it's the same sort of bucket of evidence that he was repeatedly told by people that the very fraud claims that would change the outcome were not true. As you may remember, when he was told by his campaign team, in essence, that if you can't win Arizona, you can't win the election, and then he lost Arizona, he changed out that team and went with Giuliani and his group. We also had statements from other individuals. I believe it was General Mark Milley who said he was going to leave this for the next guy. There was another staffer who overheard him saying that something to the effect of, and I want to make sure I'm not inaccurate here, it's in our final report, but basically, like, you keep fighting regardless of whether you won or lost, things of that nature, which were corroborative of the very strong evidence of that the things he was saying about the election claims were not true.
And then you said earlier, when I asked you the original question, I thank you for parsing out the various knowledge, right? The second part was that Mr. Trump knew that his claims were false. And in the report, you say that Mr. Trump, and this is a quote, knowingly made false claims. So I'm assuming that talked about the false claims he made after he knew that he had lost the election. Can you describe or summarize some of these false claims he made to the American public after he knew that he had lost the election?
Sure. These would be false claims about dead voters. It would be false claims about underage voters. It would be false claims about illegal alien voters. The false claims were generally, as a general matter, about urban centers where he had lost the vote in a particular state that was otherwise close by a lot. Yes, and again, these were claims that were rebutted by people around him who knew that they were false. and in many cases told them they were false.
Go to January 6th itself. The president gave a speech on the rally, and we received information, testimony, that a couple of things, that his supporters were leaving their weapons outside the magnetometers because they couldn't go through, and also that at some point Mr. Trump said, let them come through anyhow because they're not going to hurt me. It was subsequent to that knowledge that some of these supporters were armed, that he called on them to go to the Capitol. Was that set of facts subject to your investigation and review?
I recall what you're talking about. I remember we interviewed different people who were we interviewed people who were near or around President Trump in that period of time before the ellipse speech. And on that point, there were different recollections and different points of view. Some people said what you said. Other people had more innocuous explanations about why people stayed outside the magnetometers. Clearly, people did stay outside the magnetometers. You could see that in the video of the crowd. So I do recall that. And as I said, I remember different people hearing different parts of that and having different perspectives on it.
Metropolitan Police, as well as Secret Service, identified a number of people who were armed along the route, some of them in trees. Did you get information about that?
I don't recall. I do recall there were people who certainly had weapons at the Capitol. That I recall with certainty, and there's people who used weapons, whether they be poles or sticks or other weapons, against police officers. I know there was one officer who they took his gun. And so the use of weapons against members of law enforcement, it was outrageous, but it figured heavily in what happened at the Capitol that day.
Thank you.
I'm actually, if you don't mind, I believe it's Exhibit 10. It's your volume 1 of your report. I think we entered it as an exhibit earlier, and I'm going to direct you to page 39 of your report. And I'm going to focus on the middle paragraph. There's 3 different paragraphs on this page. I'm going to focus on the middle one that starts with Mr. Trump's intent in spreading knowing falsehoods. Do you see that paragraph, Mr. Smith?
Yes, this was this paragraph was what I was referring to when I spoke earlier.
That's what I thought. Did President Trump ever acknowledge, and I believe you talked about it in this paragraph, but did President Trump ever acknowledge that he knew that he had actually lost the election of President Biden?
Yeah, so this paragraph references different statements that he made in the presence of other people. One is that it doesn't matter if you won or lost the election, you still fight like hell. And then the other was, can you believe I lost to this effing guy?
So,
referring to Joe Biden.
So if this would have gone to a trial, and using your years of experience being a prosecutor and a trial attorney, how would you have argued this admission, Mr. Trump? Or how could you? What's a way you could have argued this admission for Mr. Trump to a jury?
Well, I think I saw these admissions as corroborative of the larger case. We would have presented what I viewed as very strong witnesses from each state to explain how the elections occurred in that state and why the events, the outcomes were trustworthy, and debunking various fraud claims that President Trump made. We would have presented the false claims that he made repeatedly, interspersed with debunkings to him or other evidence that showed they weren't true and that evidence got to him. This sort of evidence would corroborate that, but it would sort of be the cherry on top, if you will. The evidence that I felt was most powerful was the evidence that came from people in his own party who, as I said earlier, put country before party and were willing to tell the truth to him, even though it could mean trouble for them. I think witnesses like that, in my experience, would be very powerful witnesses in front of a jury, and this sort of evidence that you're pointing to here would be extra, but I think those other witnesses would be very strong proof.
And I want you to elaborate a little bit on that, on your experience with these types of witnesses. So I'm assuming, individuals from the same party as Mr. Trump pushing back on his assertions of voter fraud and various other claims. Why would that, in your opinion, have been powerful to present to a jury?
Well, I think someone who puts country before party, I think my understanding of people, of jurors, that people appreciate that. I know I certainly do. The other part about that is the reality of, like, when people speak out against their political party, there can be costs. And when people are willing to pay those costs because they believe in something, because they're going to tell the truth, I think people get that. And I think the witnesses I'm talking about, if I had to cross-examine them and make them not look credible, that would be very hard. I think that would be a very hard assignment.
You mentioned just now, as part of your trial strategy would have been, having individuals from each state come up and talk about their experiences, pushing back on Mr. Trump's false claims about the election. And one of those states you mentioned earlier was Pennsylvania. And so I do want to give Ms. Scanlon from Pennsylvania a chance to ask a few questions.
Thank you. Appreciate you being here, and certainly we were paying very close attention to this whole process in Pennsylvania, since Pennsylvania was one of the main targets for the president's attempts to overturn the 2020 election. Can you just outline for us what actions President Trump, if any, took in Pennsylvania, a state that Joe Biden clearly won, in the 2020 presidential election, to overturn its results and gain the electoral votes for himself?
Sure. Like the other 6 states involved, there were knowing false statements about fraud claims. You're testing my memory here, but one was, I remember, there was a persistent claim that more people had voted than had been given ballots. And it was a very clear thing that we were talking about 2 different elections. And there's email traffic among his staff and people who work for him about how obvious this wasn't true. And persistently kept making that statement over and over again. I also remember in Pennsylvania, the chair of the Republican Party in Pennsylvania, a guy by the name of, I think his name was Tabbas, very shortly after the election, this is in, I want to say, mid to early November, disabused President Trump of the idea that the reason his vote total, his lead was going down, was because of fraud. And he explained again, that's how, we all knew that that's how this was going to work with absentee ballots in the state of Pennsylvania, which we had very strong evidence that Trump, in fact, had been briefed upon by his campaign staff. So those aren't the only examples, but they're the ones that come to mind as I sit here now.
You have a really good memory, but that first one you mentioned, the claim that there were more ballots being cast than had been issued, is one that some of our colleagues here have repeated, despite the fact that the entire state election apparatus has contested it for 5 years now. I think your report mentions the conversation that the president had with Larry Thomas, the chair of the Republican Party, in which he explained to him just a couple days after the election concluded why Pennsylvania's system had all these absentee ballots, which Democrats had embraced because the president had told Republicans not to use them. Did the fact that the chair of the Pennsylvania Republican Party told the president that there was nothing fraudulent about the fact that the Democrats' vote total was continuing to grow, did that stop the president from continuing his efforts to promote claims of voter fraud in Pennsylvania or elsewhere?
It did not, but again, that witness, Mr. Tabbas, was of a similar group of witnesses who, these are not enemies of the president, these are people in his party who supported him. And I think the fact that they were telling him these things would have had, in my view, would have had great weight and great credibility with the jury.
It's kind of the principle that we use in the law of an admission against interest. You know, when your party loyalty would lead you to support the president, but instead you're saying, no, he's wrong. You think that might give them credibility?
Yeah, I think witnesses of that nature would have had very strong credibility.
I agree. I know some of these folks. Did President Trump try to carry out his fraudulent elector plan in Pennsylvania as well?
Yes.
And how did you do this?
Well, what happened with the elector plan was when they came up with the idea of having these fake electors, there were certain electors who would just not put up with it. Thomas Marino, I think he was from Pennsylvania.